Hello, my name is Chaffin-Quiray, and I'm the instructor for the writing workshop for May 2020 here at the Rancho Santa Fe Senior Center. Our topic is Narrators, featuring the story Moonrise by Penny Wolfson, which was first published in 2001 in the Atlantic Monthly. 2 years later, in 2003, it became the title story of her memoir, also called Moonrise. My background is teaching film and writing-related courses at Palomar Community College and also at the University of Maryland. I hope you enjoy this workshop. Given our busy lives, it is sometimes difficult to prioritize the art and entertainment we most wish to consume, so here are a few breadcrumbs, things to read, watch, and hear. In the read category, I recently pulled off my shelf The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan and The Most Fun We Ever Had by Claire Lombardo. I recently watched A Dog's Purpose by Lassie Hallstrom and On the Basis of Sex by Mimi Leder, and I listened to Dolly Parton's America, a podcast by Shima Oliai. Among books that have reverberated very strongly over the last two generations, The Feminine Mystique is no doubt near the top. Betty Friedan published the book in 1963, and you might remember it as something that was insulting, provocative, boring, quite religiously convincing of its point of view. For me, as a reader here in 2020, looking over this book, which is nearly 60 years old, I was struck by certain parallels that existed then, trying to analyze the plight of the urban and suburban housewife of the 1950s and 1960s, and the sort of domestic work that a great many of us now do in the early 21st century. In particular, I think her work is fairly lucid at trying to explore all of the various ways people have learned to accept gender roles for themselves, whether they code as male or female, feminine or masculine, or some version of those different points of view and how we express ourselves publicly and privately. She also does a fairly good job of thinking about somebody like her, a wicked smart young person coming of age in the 30s and 40s who accepts certain professional ideas about herself while also trying to marry those professional ideals with the traditional pattern of domestic life, building a family, having children, a successful marriage, which in her case all was something of a facade that she explores quite willfully throughout this book. It is certainly not for all readers, but for this reader it was a notable thing. I've often wanted to read and finally found an opportunity to do so. The second book I'd recommend is a very, very thick novel, The Most Fun We Ever Had, the debut of Claire Lombardo, which focuses on a young 60-ish couple, the Sorensens, David and Marilyn, beginning in 2016. From there, the novel has a particular pattern of going back in time through certain moments in their lives as a young married couple as they mature and begin having children. Altogether, 4 girls, all of whom have their own crises and topical problems through the ensuing 4 decades that finally bring us back to the present tense of 2016. There are some rather stunning observations of how women get along with other women, how girls turn into women, the sorts of choices that people make inside of a family to protect those they love, and also sometimes willfully trying to hurt one another as a way to demonstrate love, affection, rivalry, and the like. I found it to be quite a page-turner. It was recommended to me from my wife, and I binged on it after she was done. With 2 children in my house, a little girl and a teenage girl, we often try to find entertainment that the family can enjoy together without providing too much stuff that we might find objectionable. And the 2 new movies I'd like to recommend to you basically fit that bill. First, A Dog's Purpose is based on a young adult novel series that is the story of a dog and how this dog, through the course of multiple lives, is reincarnated to develop a sense of its purpose until its ultimate completion. The basic idea here is that a boy in the early 1960s saves a dog from heat prostration, and this dog clings to this boy. Through the course of its life, decides that this boy's satisfaction, fulfillment, and safety is its purpose. And we watch this dog grow older and die and be reincarnated through multiple other dog lives through time until this dog is reunited with its boy, who's by then become quite a man. This is a very sentimental movie. It is sappy for sure, but this guy inside of my family, I cried. And sometimes that's a very notably fun thing to go through. It was also relatively popular when it came out a few years back. The other movie, On the Basis of Sex, is a sort of docudrama about a young Ruth Bader Ginsburg who we meet first going to law school and more or less being told that she's taking up the space for a man who would be better suited for the law degree and professional outcomes that she is seeking. She has a slightly older man who is her husband. Together they have a child. He is also a legal mind and developing young person. She helps him through law school, begins her practice, is frustrated, and finally finds the case that makes her reputation, and that is a case fighting for sex discrimination from the point of view of a plaintiff, a single man, never married, wishing to care for his aged mother and pay somebody to help him, and seeking a tax deduction. In some ways, not a very sexy case, but she used it as a wedge to open up different ideas of legally how we would deal with equality between the sexes, raising her profile from being a fairly little-known academic professor of law into being a civil rights activist. And of course, we know her now as the notorious RBG sitting atop the Supreme Court. It's a pretty good movie. The four of us enjoyed ourselves. We were able to get through it. The arguments aren't too tense, and the various performers on screen are likable facsimiles to the real people we might meet had we been there in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Finally, in this set of breadcrumbs, I'd like to recommend Dolly Parton's America. I believe it was a 9-part podcast from WNYC Studios, and it takes the position that Dolly Parton, the country western singer turned actress, media mogul, might be an interesting metaphor to look at different parts of the American experience. This includes the sort of hillbilly white trash personality that she seems to suggest based on her background from the southeastern United States. It also uses her body to reflect on femininity, known for being a platinum blonde, very curvy young woman who used that very honestly and directly in her humor to advance her cause. It thinks about the development of her music career from its roots in folk music dating back into Europe and various migrations across the Atlantic Ocean into the present as we move into all of the mix that we see from AM radio to FM radio. It thinks about Dolly Parton as an entrepreneur who has been able to expand the reach of her brand, Dolly Parton, into Dollywood, her amusement park, into the cabins that she has purchased and maintained for her family members, into the body of work that she's licensed to other performers. And it generally considers her to be a complicated figure to think about the last roughly 60 or 70 years of American experience. I largely listened to this podcast while just taking walks in my neighborhood for daily exercise and found myself very sucked in to the story of Dolly Parton, a person I've known about really all of my adult life, but not paid much attention to as an important artist or entertainer. I never quite got it. But after hearing this podcast, which excerpts some of her music, some of her stage appearances, some of her speech events, some of her acting performances, I was won over to think that Dolly Parton is indeed a great entertainer, artist, and in this instance, a good podcast subject. All of this is to say, our subject today is narrators. Who is telling the story might be the basic idea behind what a narrator is, and I'm sure if you recall the training that you had as a young person coming through grade school into high school, college, life afterwards, and so on, you've no doubt bumped into the notion that there are different points of view from which a story, whether fiction or nonfiction, can be told. As you see on screen, these positions are largely called the first person, the second person, and the third person. There are details I'd like to expand just to sort of put these ideas back in your head if you haven't thought about them in a while, before we proceed to, I think, a useful example, and that is the story Moonrise by Penny Wolfson. First, the first-person narrator is the storyteller who speaks from the position of I. I drink water is a first-person point-of-view narrator describing the drinking of water. The second person is somebody else in the room speaking back to you, saying something like, quote, "You drink water," close quote. This narrator is observing the circumstances of a given story, but speaking to you, the reader of this story, quite directly. The third person is sometimes outside of the immediate circumstance, describing it from a variety of their own points of view. The third person point of view tends to be the kind that we meet most often in audiovisual media and is very commonly used throughout literature and has been used for a great many years. The third person is aware of things that the I, who is drinking the water, cannot know because the I position, the first person position, is restricted to one point of view, a given character, and that's it. The second person point of view is a direct observer, like a journalist watching the activity, similarly restricted to what that observer can see, hear, smell, touch, etc. But the third person can float. The third person has great flexibility to move around a scene, to know things that no one character can know, including the thoughts, feelings, and memories of various characters in a particular scene, and the third person point of view can know things about the galaxy, about the universe, things that are well outside the purview of a given story that can be shared. This third person point of view can sometimes be further distributed into three different modes. One is the omniscient third person, truly the voice of God or gods, standing well apart from the overall universe of a story, capable of describing, on the one hand, what a character drank, in that earlier scene I was trying to imagine with you, to what makes a drink possible, to how glass is constructed, to the molecular structure of water, to the temperature of a day, to what's happening on Mars at this very moment, simply because the omniscient narrator, the third person omniscient, knows everything. The more typical way we do third person, however, is the limited third person, which is a point of view outside of the immediate story to connect points of view, emotions, memories among various characters in a setting that move the story along, but is still limited to various ideas the author, the narrator, ultimately is trying to share. Therefore, a limited third-person narrator describing a group of people having drinks over a table, as my earlier example suggested, is not going to wander away and talk about the construction of glass or the molecular structure of water, because the limited third-person narrator is trying to advance the story right in front of them, and that's really it. This third-person narrator is also knowledgeable, is able to shape textures, to move around a room, to look at details, to think about things that exist inside of the scene but are not immediately going to be necessary for a given character inside of a scene to understand, but can be very useful to you, the reader, to involve you in enjoying the work at hand. There's a third form of third person, sometimes called the free indirect style, which is kind of loosey-goosey, goes back several hundred years in its way of being written down by various prominent writers, and the gist here is free indirect style allows a writer to very, very promiscuously move among the first, second, and third person points of view within the same story, book, whatever it may be, and shift moment by moment. This free indirect style can be quite irritating because it does, in one sentence, present a first-person point of view. I drink water. Drift to a second-person point of view in the very next sentence. You drink water too. And moving finally to the third-person point of view in the third sentence. They drink water and think about the nature of their love with one another dating back 40 years. Those abrupt shifts in tone, which free indirect style allow, can be invigorating to certain forms of experimentation, but it's not useful for all readers, for all writers, indeed for all of literature. But, and here I want to emphasize the final note you see on screen, distance matters. All narrators present characters in a story world from a discrete distance. That distance can be quite close, literally quite close. They can be right next to somebody's face, describing the pores on their skin. They can be across a room. They can be across a valley. Or in the case of an omniscient third-person point of view narrator, they can be well apart, off of the world itself, describing things from a great remove. In general, I suggest that narrators that impact us well generally are very close to the subjects at hand. They're capable of describing very closely observed things about the characters that we might meet. Earlier on, I suggested to you The Most Fun We Ever Had, a novel I've recently consumed, and one of the great things that writer, Claire Lombardo, does well is describe closely, from a limited third-person point of view, the characters inside of this family, the way they look, what they enjoy eating, how they wince when other characters make certain remarks which are not intended to be ruinous or hurtful, but nonetheless are, because a great many families have those tensions of love, affection, hatred, and dislike all mixed in together. So, a narrator can be the first-person point of view, the second-person point of view, the third-person point of view. And the important thing for any writer to engage with and any reader to be aware of is that the proximity to the subject at hand matters. If we are truly omniscient and well away from the subject, we describe them at such a remove, what they do and say, it's very difficult to feel emotionally connected to the circumstances at hand. On the other hand, if our narrator moves in close, literally and figuratively, to be right next to and intimately associated with their subject, we can sometimes have and experience great literary magic. This brings us to our showpiece for the day, and that is the story Moonrise, first published in 2001 in the Atlantic Monthly. It received the National Magazine Award in Feature Writing that year, and it was then anthologized thereafter in many collections dealing with families and health issues, particularly from the perspective of mothers caring for children. This writer, Penny Wolfson, was able to roll that success into a book-length work called Moonrise, One Family, Genetic Identity, and Muscular Dystrophy, which she published in 2003. The brief background to set up who this person is, Penny Wolfson, you ought to know that she earned a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Fine Arts from Sarah Lawrence College, where she ended up teaching nonfiction writing from 2001 through 2010, roughly overlapping with the period of this emergence into some success. Her writing on disability from the point of view of a mother of a disabled child has appeared in the New York Times, Good Housekeeping, Exceptional Parent, and other publications, and as I mentioned, she has been much anthologized in a variety of collections that think about parenting of children who are not normal in some way. The particular abnormality that Penny Wolfson tackles in her life and in her writing is the experience of her firstborn child, a son named Ansel, who for several years appeared to be a very normally developing young boy, but when he was in his early childhood phase, I think roughly age 4 or 5, began exhibiting abnormalities which were a concern to his parents. Under medical supervision, he was diagnosed with a particular form of muscular dystrophy, and they were told, it is unlikely that your boy is going to reach maturity, that is, age 18 to 21, and it's very unlikely that he'll escape his 20s, that he will die young, and towards the end of his life, his body will collapse on itself, and he will die quite miserably and quite painfully. This was hard news to hear, as no doubt you can guess, and Penny Wolfson's life, in some respects, turns into an experience of how it is she can care for her boy, help him grow, help him find himself, as all parents try to help their children find themselves, but also how to deal with his disability and to expand the prospects for his vitality, health, and well-being. This story, Moonrise, is not a downer. I don't want you to feel that way if you've never encountered it before, but it does exhibit the first-person narrator's point of view, and it is a bit of creative nonfiction. To reiterate, the first-person narrator of this story is this writer, Penny Wolfson, describing herself, her husband, her son, and her other 2 children in the mix of their lives together, bouncing through time, trying to figure out how to care for Ansel as he grows from, when we meet him in the story, a young teenager into a slightly older teenager. That's all well and good, but I also want you to notice that phrase, creative nonfiction. I know this can be a loop for some readers, for some listeners, maybe even to these remarks I'm sharing with you, but creative nonfiction assumes that a story must be told by a storyteller, and the way that storytelling works involves making choices about what to emphasize, what to avoid, what needs to be dressed up with good language, what needs to be blunt. In effect, creative nonfiction employs all of the mediation we associate with fiction writing, but applies it to a truthful experience. In this truthful experience, it's the story of a mother caring for her son, that ends up being a relatively happy ending. And I direct you, if you're curious, to the link you see in the bottom of the page, which is an interview with Penny Wolfson and her son Ansel Lurio from 2019. This is to say that Ansel way went past the expectations of his medical team as a boy and lived to be in his middle 30s when this recording was made, interviewing himself and his mother, and to my best knowledge lives and thrives to this day. Moonrise is divided into roughly 5 sections, and the story breaks down in some of those sections into smaller parts offset from one another with some double spacing. I want to give you an impression of what this story sounds like by reading aloud to you some of its excerpt. I want to begin at the beginning and read roughly a paragraph from each section and conclude with the way the story concludes. And this, I think, will provide you an idea of how the first-person narrator works inside of a piece of creative nonfiction. We begin this way. Moonrise, Penny Wolfson. At the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, Arizona, my husband Joe and I are looking at prints of Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico by Ansel Adams. A slender young man in a suit has brought us, as requested, 3 versions of this famous photograph. He dons a pair of white gloves before removing the 14 1/20 by 18 1/20 enlargements from their plexiglass sheaths, opens the hinged glass viewing case in front of us, and places the photographs carefully, lovingly, on a slanted white board inside. He stands there while we examine the pictures. When we are finished, he'll repeat the process in reverse. This is the opening paragraph of the story. What we learn here is that our writer, Penny, is writing from the I position. She's married to a man named Joe. They're on a walkabout to go look at photographs of a photographer, Ansel Adams. No doubt you've heard of him. Somebody they celebrate privately as quite important. And the particular celebration they're looking for is this image of Moonrise. As we move through the piece to her first section header, it's called 1, Falling, 1998. And it begins in this way. I am at the Grand Union in Dobbs Ferry, New York, with my son Ansel, who is 13 years old. It's raining. He begged to come, so I brought him, not really wanting to, because I had to bring his wheelchair too. It weighs more than 200 pounds and isn't easy to maneuver into the minivan, even with the ramp. I have to wrestle the motorized chair until it faces forward, and then, bending and squeezing into the narrow confines of the van, I have to fasten it to the floor with several clasps. By the time I have done this even once, I'm irritable. A trip to the supermarket means doing it twice and undoing it twice. Here, this narrator, Penny, is talking about her experiences moving her son around, this son Ansel, named for the photographer who we met at the open of the overall story. Time has passed. She's become a suburban mother living in Dobbs Ferry, New York, which is one reason why I'm attracted to this story, and for a time I lived in that region of lower New York, familiar with some of these environments in places like Grand Union, a supermarket chain. Nonetheless, what we hear in this passage is Penny reflecting on the difficulty of moving her boy around in his wheelchair, getting him on board a minivan, going to the store for simple errands that normally take folks not very long at all, but for her is more of an arduous journey. You'll notice then that the first-person point of view from this story so far is restricted entirely to what Penny knows, what she thinks, what she remembers, and has almost nothing to say about what anybody else knows, thinks, or remembers unless they interact with her, unless they talk, which does happen in the course of the story. That's an advantage and disadvantage both to the first-person narrator. The first-person narrator can tell us that she's irritable when she loads her son's 200-pound wheelchair into her minivan, that it's a difficult thing to undo it and do it twice for safety reasons and the like. That's very close. It's proximate to the problem and subject of this story. But it's just Penny. We don't know what Ansel thinks about all of this. We don't know if it brings terrific excitement into his day to think about and to execute going to the supermarket. We just don't know. The second passage of Moonrise opens this way. 2. Chaos, 1999. The New York Academy of Medicine on 103rd Street and 5th Avenue is not exactly in the slums, but it's not really the Upper East Side either. On a dreary, drizzling morning, I park at the Metropolitan Museum garage on 80th Street and walk up Madison past Banana Republic and Ann Taylor and patisseries and fancy meat purveyors and little French children's as clothing shops that display sashed dresses with hand-embroidered yokes in their windows. But above 96th Street, near the Mount Sinai Hospital complex, the scenery and the people change abruptly. Everything's older and more run down. Street peddlers hawk books, batteries, Yankees caps, cheap scarves, acrylic ski caps, $5 handbags. I see an obese black man leaning on a cane, harried-looking workers with Mount Sinai badges, a woman exiting a hospital building through a revolving door carrying crutches. These are very concrete things that she's observing in this passage, telling us very exactly where she is. And again, having lived in New York City, these are streets I have walked. These are adjustments in these neighborhood blocks, block to block, sometimes even feet apart, describing different socioeconomic classes of people, different races, different professions, different senses of maintenance in the physical structure of the world. And all of this bears down on Penny, because she's here in 1999 seeking care for her son Ansel, who's growing older, but is also exhibiting more and more trouble due to his muscular dystrophy. Again, this first-person narrator, always writing from the I position, did something interesting in this passage, and that is move into the present. I park a car rather than I parked a car. This sort of a shift in time can be a little bit unnerving, but it also brings us very intimately close to the journey she's describing. It is a success of proximity and of detailed observation, which to this reader proves quite helpful. It's an emotional hook that keeps me going. As we move along in the story, the third section begins this way. 3. Moonrise, 2000. Ansel and I are on 165th Street in Washington Heights on our way to the doctor at the Neurological Institute. I picked him up at school, and he told me he loves me, and he does at least once a day, and then we drove here and parked in the Kinney lot where, because of our handicapped placard, the attendants let us squeeze into a ground-level spot. This is becoming a story, a love story, really, between a mother and son, which is the overall point she's trying to present. In this final passage of section 3, she moves through a set of different interviews that they undergo with his practitioners, figuring out how he feels versus how he felt a year before, what he thinks is going well, what he thinks is not going well, and so on. And then we have a scattering of observations, offset one to the other with space holders that help us understand that this is a life that's unraveling a bit, is difficult, is troublesome for our writer, Penny. I want to jump towards the end of the piece to its conclusion to signal how this piece ends and provide maybe a concluding remark about narrators. There's a section that runs to about 5 paragraphs length, and it concludes in this way. Ansel says everything that happens has a reason. He uses the toilet in the middle of the night and flushes it, and the flood of water in the pipes wakes up our collie in the basement, and she begins barking, and I wake up and it is 3:45. In a way, I'm not tired, so I get up and go down to the basement where the dog is kenneled. She is wide awake and on her feet, waiting expectantly as though we planned a rendezvous. She nips my heels and tries to push through my legs as we mount the stairs. Then she shoots outside and I follow. It's warm out and completely calm. The 3/4 moon is immense and neon yellow, hanging over the Palisades, nearly merging with the horizon. It seems otherworldly, like, and I know this is a ridiculous thought, an object from outer space. In other words, it appears as it is, completely apart from, oblivious of, anything human. I don't know if it's rising or setting. Joe will be able to tell me in the morning, but right now, I don't want to know, not yet. I stand there with the mystery of the moon for some time, with the thrill of knowing its beauty, having it to myself for a few rare moments, while the dog sniffs under damp leaves, looking for a place to pee. When she is finished, I take her back to the basement and give her a full bowl of water, which she drinks thirstily. I go to sleep easily, somehow fulfilled. Ansel says everything has a reason. He is 15. In 2 hours, it will be daylight. And that's the conclusion of the story, which mimics the open in that we're approaching a new day from the approach of an old day, that is the moonrise itself. We're thinking about this woman's point of view, Penny, and in this final passage, we are reading her present tense remarks about what's going on. We go outside. She shoots beyond me. I follow. This verbiage places us in the present, but of course we need to do a certain kind of a trick to ourselves as we read this passage from this story, knowing that Penny Wolfson wrote this fully 20 years ago in 2000, published the story a year later, and yet every time we read it, we are experiencing the present circumstance of this restricted first-person narrator thinking about the life she's living. She's the wife of a doctor, the primary caregiver to 3 children, the oldest of whom is suffering from and sometimes escaping from the difficulties of living with muscular dystrophy. She is sometimes overwhelmed by the causes and the troubles and the joys of her daily life, but is still capable of seeing natural phenomenon at work in her life. He is 15. In 2 hours it will be daylight. It's a very nice conclusion, at least to this writer. And so concludes then this lesson on narrators focused on Penny Wolfson's story Moonrise. This has been the May 2020 Writers' Workshop at the Rancho Santa Fe Senior Center.